take communists, socialists, and these other words out and say they came for MAGA and I didn't say anything because I wasn't MAGA. They came for the conservatives and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a conservative. They came for the Christians and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Christian. One day, this overreach, this federal government that's so powerful is going to come for you. And who's going to be there to stand side by side to defend your liberties and your freedoms if you aren't willing to stand up today and fight for them? Good evening, you beautiful American patriots, and welcome back to the Constitutional Corner. This is Mark Hogan, and I'm your host, Craig McMichael.
Hello, everybody.
I know today we were going to discuss inflation, but with this FBI raid on Trump's Mar-Lago, I want to switch in and talk about government overreach and the size of our federal government.
Right. No matter how you feel about Trump, we want to see how this relates to the Constitution. That's why we're here, right?
We're going to get into the Constitution and discuss the inner workings of the executive branch. Article 1 or Article 2, Section 1. The executive is the President of the United States. And really what I want to point out, what I want to mention to people is the very fabric of your republic is under attack. The things that you hold near and dear are under attack. And I'm not just speaking about President Trump. We're going to go through some historical issues. But I want you to think about some of the episodes we've had before and realize when the founders discussed the standing army and the fear of a standing army, were they talking about what we see today with our federal police state, with the agencies that control so much power in the government and are absolutely tyrannical on the people of this country through taxation and oppression? And is that police state what the founders feared through a standing army?
Right. It doesn't have to be the United States Army or Marines. It can be the powerful departments within the bureaucracy of the United States.
That's correct. And you know, it's interesting because a lot of polls will show that most Americans hold the military in the highest standard of the government. Right. Their approval ratings are higher than any other government agency. Congress is 11%, I think, currently. This is something people should stop and sit down and ask themselves, why is that? Why is our government disapproved of so much? What kind of freedoms and liberties have they taken from us? How have they stifled our right to live free as a people and to enjoy the fruits of our labor? Some of the founders had quotes in this. Madison's one of my favorites. We talk about him quite often. Madison had a quote I like: "Taxation with representation can be tyranny." And that's something people forget, is even though you have representation, unlike they had it before the Declaration,
right,
you can still live under tyranny through a federal government. Madison also said an overgrown executive will not be a safe company to liberty. So he's talking about Article 2, Section 1, and they're talking about the executive branch. If you allowed the executive branch to institute all these organizations and all these police parties, then your liberty is going to be stifled. The more the government grows, the more it consumes, the less freedom and liberty that you're going to enjoy as an American citizen.
Right, and it always grows like a ratchet, bigger, 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 never smaller.
That's right. And Sam Adams, not the guy that made the beer, but the founder, he said such a professional army was and always dangerous to the liberties of the people. Now, he was talking about a standing army. They were debating, should the federal government have a standing army? But he was talking about the dangers of a standing army. And you'll see this through the police state that we have now. And a lot of people, when you say that to them, they think, Craig, you are crazy. There's not a police state. We need these agencies. They're protecting us. They used to protect us. But anytime you give away freedom for security because you're afraid of something, the agencies will grow beyond your control and they will start to contaminate the liberty. The foundation, the fountain of liberty will be contaminated with the tyranny that the government opposes upon you.
So government overreach. A little more, a little more, a little more. Look at the IRS.
The IRS is a big one. And so let's talk about this for a second. A lot of people don't know, but the IRS in the last few years has bought 4,500 guns and 5 million rounds of ammunition. And I would ask you, why does the IRS, it's imposing tax law need these things. And people might say, well, they have to do a raid on a business. That's what the local police are for. That's the separation of powers. That's what your state should do. It's interesting, too. The IRS currently has about 67,000 agents. They've just been approved by this Inflation Reduction Act. I love that name.
Well, they're going to double the amount of agents, right?
More than double. They're going to add 87,000 new agents to the IRS. And what's fascinating about this is the IRS will now have more agents working for it than the entire military of the United Kingdom. Think about that for a second. Now, I know we have a lot more citizens than the UK does, but we now have one government agency that is larger than the entire military for the United Kingdom. And a point beyond that that's fascinating is people don't realize this. The federal government currently is the largest employer in the world. Our federal government employs more people than any other company in the world. It has outgrown any private business or entity. And that is really not something our founders envisioned,
Right.
thought about, or wanted.
And a scary thought for me is the people that run these bureaucracies and departments are unelected. They're generally appointed by the current administration.
This is what, when you hear people talk about the deep state, this is exactly what they're talking about.
Right. Swamp.
They're talking about the people that are in Washington, and their livelihoods depend on this. And look, I understand, even though all these departments are unconstitutional, you can't just abolish them tomorrow. One, it would be an economic destruction. The amount of people in the federal government that would lose their jobs would decimate our economy. But you can start to fight back and reduce these agencies. Here's another example, the Veterans Administration. I'm a veteran. I personally don't go to the VA. I utilize the VA when people talk about government health care. I had government health care in the military. And basically the first response was, my bone is hanging out of my body. And they're like, take some Motrin and go home. Government health care is not the solution, but the VA, you should ask yourself, why did they buy 11 million rounds of ammunition? What does the Veterans Administration need with 11 million rounds of ammunition?
Yeah, they're there to put people back together and not tear them apart.
That's right. And why is the government buying these weapons and guns that they're trying to make illegal for us to buy? Because they're buying shotguns, which we talked about under the 1943
Right.
or 34. Was it 34 or 43?
It was a 1934 Firearms
National
Act.
Firearms Act. That's right.
Automatic weapons and shotguns.
That's right. Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services bought 1,300 guns and 4 million rounds of ammunition.
Well, look at the post office. I don't have the numbers on that, but it's right along those lines too.
Yep. The Social Security Administration, charged with collecting and handing out Social Security, about 800,000 rounds of ammunition. We should stop and ask ourselves, why? Why would the Health and Human Services Department or the Social Security Administration be buying weapons or guns?
I wonder what percentage of their employees are actually armed, and they'll justify they need this to enforce this or that or check on this or protect themselves. But what percentage of the employees are in that category? Probably 1 or 2%, maybe.
Yeah, well, no federal employee should be in that category. There's no federal employee that should be armed with a weapon to impose anything, because Article 1 does not give the federal government under the enumerations the power to police state its populace. That's what the states are for.
Well, the opposition would say, what about the FBI? They're out there, they're on the streets, they're undercover, they're making busts and coordinating with the local police, sure, but...
I could see when the FBI was formed, and really it was very Gestapo-like under Hoover when it was formed, the way they spied on people.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about the Sedition Act?
And they're still doing that today. I could see when it was formed with the lack of technology, why it was important to have a police force that could cross state lines and deal with things. But today, in today's day and age, especially anybody that works in law enforcement talks to each other. States can communicate with one another. Crossing a state line to capture a criminal is not such a big deal anymore.
Right.
Somebody commits a crime in Texas and gets picked up in Louisiana, they're going to extradite them back to our state.
Well, do you remember those old movies when they're having a police chase along the highway, and there's a state line 1 mile away. We make it and then they would cross that line, jump out of the car, and laugh at the cops.
Yeah,
that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, that's not the case. Another one I thought was interesting is the Smithsonian, which is just a museum. They hired 620 armed guards for the Smithsonian. And you could say, okay, well, they need to guard the Smithsonian. Why do they need armed guards there? Isn't there DC
A
police?
security force
Capitol
of some
Police.
kind, even an independent contractor. Maybe people have very valuable collectibles in their home that need to be rated.
Yeah, well, yeah, they definitely want to come in and see everything.
And the Smithsonian police show up.
Yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is currently there are more non-DOD government employees than the entire United States Marine Corps. That should be a worry for people. Our federal government is not supposed to be that big. That's not the preview. That's not what the Constitution assigned the federal government. That's exactly what the founders feared, was an overbearing, powerful executive federal government without a separation of powers that squanched your liberty. And I'm telling you, anybody that can hear my voice, one day you're going to wake up and the very fabric of the republic that you love and hold so dear will be collapsed. The freedoms that you cherish and enjoy won't be here. A lot of people that I talk to often say, well, Craig, this is America. Things, you're conspiracy theorists, things won't go that way. The freedoms and the liberties that you enjoy today, the nice shopping malls, the movie theaters, the roads, those things were not always here, and they will not always be here. As Reagan said, freedom is one generation away from being lost.
I think there's a lot of people taking this country for granted.
That's right. We do not pass our freedom and liberty down in the bloodstream to our children. And if we don't wake up and actually find our voices and make our voices heard, our children are going to live in tyranny that we wouldn't understand. They're going to have a federal government that comes after them. Let's talk about some instances of this. Let's talk about 9/11. 9/11 is close to me. I was in Darwin, Australia on 9/11. I ended up being one of the first ground units in Afghanistan. After that, it was the first time I saw combat. But 9/11, really, the government utilized the fear that we saw during 9/11 to start the Patriot Act.
Right, the Patriot Act, which bred the FISA courts and so forth.
The FISA courts, and everybody championed it at the time.
There's no way that they could ever cheat with the FISA courts. And what have we learned lately?
So the FISA courts, for you that don't know, is generally a panel of 3 judges that make a ruling in private on a warrant for terrorist activities.
Mm-hmm.
The FISA court was one of the courts that was utilized for Russian collusion against President Trump when they started those impeachments. They used a fake foreign dossier that was not supposed to be done, and the FBI did all of this. And you're talking about an FBI where you had Lisa Page and Peter Strunk. I can't pronounce his name. I don't really like him anyways. I saw him on CNN the other day.
I think they're paying him to come on now.
It was fascinating. He's on CNN talking about how we should trust and enjoy the FBI, that they're doing a good job. And it's just conservative conspiracy theories, because when the FBI was investigating Hillary Clinton, nobody was outraged about it. But the fascinating part is when the FBI investigated Hillary Clinton, they didn't issue a search warrant for the Secretary of State's house to find a server that had classified information on it.
Right, subpoenaed information, subpoenaed documents. And that server didn't even belong there. It was a secret server. There was no raid in the middle of the morning. And
That's correct. And what's fascinating is that server had classified information, and that server was accessed by foreign agencies that got that information because there wasn't enough security. And after they subpoenaed it, Hillary Clinton and her people deleted the server.
Right.
And when they asked her, she made a joke and said, "What, with a rag?"
She played ignorant.
People that don't know, I've talked about this before, but I do cybersecurity for a living. I've dealt with computer networks since 1996. I dealt with networks in the military. I built tactical networks and shipborne networks. You don't just accidentally delete a server. Most things, when you delete, they're not gone. You have to actually put effort into deleting something.
Right.
Even from a little removable media thumb drive. You could highlight everything, hit delete. Those files are still there, and somebody like me could find them if I wanted to.
It's also a known fact that they took all their devices, like their telephones, and they beat them to pieces with hammers.
Yeah, and so telephones...
So they couldn't be, washed and looked at.
Yeah, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the Patriot Act and what it allowed the government to do with our telephones. We learned through Edward Snowden that the federal government is monitoring your phone calls. They're collecting your emails and your text messages, and they're storing them in massive databases where they can collate and search for certain words that you might use in communications. This is a clear violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, illegal search and seizure. You should have, the Fifth Amendment says you should be secure in your life, liberty, and property. The government does not have the right to spy on you because they made us afraid of terrorists. Another one I want to talk about is, let's go all the way back to 2012. It's 10 years ago, so a lot of people forget. Let's talk about the IRS in 2012. Even the federal government as a whole. Locally here in Texas, there was a lady, Catherine Engelbright, I think's her name. She has an organization called True the Vote. She was looking for a 501c charity organization for
501c3 nonprofit.
Nonprofit for registering voters. And the Obama administration never approved these things. And to stifle her freedoms, I could be wrong on these numbers, but I believe she actually got hit with 6 IRS audits through personal and business audits. Mm-hmm. OSHA came to visit her businesses to make sure she was on the up and up.
What a coincidence, yeah.
It's amazing. The federal government wielded the power that we just freely gave away because we feel like they need it. And they stifled the liberties and freedoms of one of our fellow citizens.
You know, it's a real shame in the past few years, and that's a great example. These government agencies, the trust is evaporated by the common people for these agencies. And one side says, oh, that's great, they're going after this guy. And the other side says, oh, they're picking on me. But it's not the straight and narrow like it should be. It's like whatever administration's in charge, you're sicking them on your political enemies. And that's a banana republic, man.
It is something we should be afraid of. And the faction politics is the issue. Something I'll just mention this now, something I wanted to talk about was in World War II. Obviously, we know what the Germans did in World War II, but somebody that survived that wrote a beautiful poem. And I'm going to try to remember this. Let's see. They came for the communist, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialist, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to say anything for me.
Right.
This is exactly what we're dealing with today with our government. Take communists, socialists, and these other words out and say they came for MAGA, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't MAGA. They came for the conservatives, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a conservative. They came for the Christians, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Christian. One day, this overreach, this federal government that's so powerful is going to come for you. And who's going to be there to stand side by side to defend your liberties and your freedoms if you aren't willing to stand up today and fight for them?
No politician is going to come and save you. It's up to us.
That's right. We've talked about in the past ones. And, and let's go back to the FBI real quick. So I read a report in Congress the other day. The FBI put out a document stating certain flags are white supremacy flags. And it was fascinating when you saw the list, the Come and Take It flag, the Gonzalez flag, the Betty Ross flag.
Betsy Ross,
which is one of the original flags. I mean, they're labeling these symbols as white supremacy. And if you talk to the government, if you listen to our current elected officials, they talk about white supremacy. And okay, yes, there are white supremacists in this country. There are Nazis in this country. There are also people on the other side that are radical and out there. That's what you get with freedom. You can't have freedom if you don't allow the people to be that crazy fringe. You just have to recognize what they are and ignore them. But to label that white supremacists is the biggest threat to this country, when in your heart, if you don't see the biggest threat to the country currently is your federal government, that is the problem. I get this question like, Craig, what do we do? I think a lot of people personally aren't involved in the government or voting or elections or politicking or any of that because it just seems too much. It's too overwhelming. It's too large. It's too big.
And you feel too small and you can't make a difference.
You can't change anything. And so I tell people all the time, you're right, you can't change anything overnight. Think about it. The federal government that we see today is not the federal government from the 1840s. It's not the federal government from the 1915, before the income tax. It's not the federal government before the welfare state in the 60s. This did not change overnight. This was a slow erosion of the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy because people were so comfortable and so busy in their lives, they didn't stop and look around and put a foot down. You're not going to change this overnight. This is something in my generation that if we ever win our freedoms back, may not ever be won back by the time I'm alive. It might be something my children have to fight for. But it's something that at some point you have to stand up. Start local. Start in your communities. Challenge your school boards. Challenge your local state reps. Push the states to start nullification of federal laws that are unconstitutional. Have governors fight back. Have state senators make a difference. Forget the federal government. It is lost. There's no way anybody's going to get elected and go to the federal government and save us. Even, and this is why I think they attack Donald Trump so much, he's the first person in a long time that went and actually pointed out and fought the deep state. And when they attacked him, instead of cowering in the corner like most politicians do, he stood up and fought back.
Right.
And that terrified them.
He showed everybody that you can fight back, and you will get the flack of all the, obviously the opposition party, but social media and the news media, which is in the pocket for the left. You've got all that coming at you, and they can say whatever they want. They can throw whatever they want at you, and it doesn't have to stick. It just needs to leave a stain and control the narrative of what we're talking about now. And if they can get you on the defensive from these accusations, you're kind of playing their game. But he didn't play their game.
That's exactly right. And you know, love or hate Trump, I'm not here to convince you one way or another. I'm here to talk about the Constitution, but I'm also here to talk about what's fair. Let's look at what they did to this gentleman. So Donald Trump ran for president. Everybody laughed at him. He's never going to win. He's never going to win. And I'll be honest, when he first ran, I wasn't a Donald Trump supporter.
I wasn't a great big fan of his, you know.
I wasn't. I voted in the primary for someone else. When the election came around and I had a choice between Trump and Clinton, I couldn't vote for Clinton. She just seemed too corrupt. And people say, well, Trump's corrupt. The media has said Trump's corrupt. I've never had anybody actually prove corruption in Donald Trump. So he wins. He goes after the federal government. What do? Russian collusion. We spend a year and a half, 2 years, congressional hearings, committees,
impeachments,
investigations.
It drove the news, right?
And they couldn't find anything on Russian collusion. The Mueller investigation came out and said there was no wrongdoing there, that it was all fake or whatever they said. So they couldn't impeach him for that. So then what do? They take a phone call from Ukraine where apparently he was talking to President Zelensky, trying to find out information about Joe Biden's involvement in Ukraine. Another threat to the deep state.
And they were on the road to leaking and creating their own set of what this conversation could have been. And lo and behold, he released the transcript. There it is in black and white.
That's right.
It blew their whole thing out of the water.
He threw it right in their face. And they impeached this man over that. We impeached a president of the United States over a conversation with a foreign leader where he didn't do anything illegal. The Democrats knew that the impeachment wouldn't go anywhere in the Senate. It was all about pushing a narrative and changing the hearts and minds of the people.
Created the news. Yeah, I don't know how many people I've talked to that say, well, he was impeached twice. That is not a conclusion. That was a debacle, you know?
So then what happens? You have the election. There are some questions about the validity of the election, and that's for another day. We've discussed that before. And so now, insurrection. We're going to go after President Trump for insurrection.
Very important word.
Very important word, because the 14th Amendment says if you are involved in insurrection against the U.S. government, you can never hold political office again. This is why they're using it. Would be the first insurrection in the history of the world that was committed by a group of people without a weapon. And so they do this January 6th investigation. Liz Cheney is a Republican that's, God knows what's wrong with her, on that committee. The Democrats, they hold hearings. They don't let people to argue against witnesses. They just take statements.
Hearings.
Yeah, hearings.
With no exculpatory evidence, no word from the other side. Witnesses favorable to one side eliminated.
We get to the end of the January 6th hearings, and they still have no evidence on Donald Trump. They still have nothing to hold him accountable for.
But they've driven the news for months and months and months.
They've changed hearts and minds of people, and now what do you see? You see an FBI raid over classified documents that a president is allowed to take after he leaves office. He'd been working with the National Archives to return what they wanted. In June, they returned 10 boxes.
So let's tie this to the Constitution.
Let me finish this point real quick, because here's what they're trying to do. They did the raid because they're looking for January 6th evidence, because they're trying to stop this gentleman from running for office again. And here's the dangerous part that I want to mention to the viewer. Donald Trump was a former president of the United States. If the government can wield so much power and tarnish his name and come after him in that way, only imagine what they could do to you. Imagine how safe you'll be if somebody decides you've stepped out of line and you need to be put back in your place. Let's go to the Constitution of this.
So what pops into my mind is the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, protections against illegal search and seizure, unreasonable search and seizure, which is a bit vague, right? What's reasonable, what's not. So
you have to list exactly what you're searching for, which they didn't entirely do. They didn't allow the attorneys to follow them through the house.
well, we're still waiting on the affidavit. Now it's going to be redacted next week. Is that correct?
That's what I'm hearing. I'll be interested to see what the redaction of that is. But
It's
you
going
got
to be a page full of black lines, I can already tell you.
You got to remember, the media is trying to confuse you. You keep hearing in the news classified documents, and then I heard ultra classified documents. I served 10 years in the military. For 2 of those years, I worked at Mar-4 in the CMS vault with all the classified material for the Pacific region. I never heard of ultra classified before.
Well, that's
I had a top secret SCI clearance. That was the highest clearance I knew existed. I could be wrong. There might be something above that. But the ultra classified, and now they're saying there were nuclear codes, and anybody that believes there were nuclear codes on a piece of paper that
Yeah.
weren't changed.
how
that the
dangerous,
president-
because they can't change those or anything. I mean, they have to hand that over, right?
So all of this is fascinating to me. And what they're doing is they're setting a narrative. They're changing the hearts and minds of people. It's like Joseph Goebbels said, you tell a lie enough for long enough and people will believe it.
Half the people I know still think that Trump is a Russian agent. Can't argue with them.
Well, you know, it's interesting. If he was a Russian agent, why didn't Russia invade Ukraine when Trump was in office? They had the same military.
It would have been a very friendly
They had
thing
the
to
same
do, right?
power. He definitely wouldn't have been sending billions of dollars to Ukraine to help kill Russians. So you could blow that theory out of the water with a little bit of common sense. The whole thing. One last thing I want to mention is Fast and Furious. Some of y'all forget this. Fast and Furious was our government selling guns illegally in the border areas, I believe to cartels, to try to raise violence on the border. And I don't know their end game, but I would speculate, if we just want to go in speculation land for a minute, that the end game there was gun control. If you make the violence on the border bad enough. Unfortunately, a Border Patrol agent was killed through one of these guns, and they confiscated. They figured out what was going on. Congress tried to do an investigation, subpoenaed Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General, and he actually refused to go testify before Congress. President Obama at the time declared executive privilege. If you want to talk about classified documents, President Obama took almost 30,000 classified documents out of the White House.
So when the Clintons left, I think they took about half the White House with them.
Probably.
Furniture and all.
Probably. So you have to ask yourself, why is one group of people allowed to do almost anything and then enforce power and rules on others? And a lot of people don't care because they're like, well, I agree with this person. You know, they support my ideas and my beliefs. That's the danger. That's the danger, because one day they're going to take the power and they're going to stifle and oppress all of us. And they're not going to stop. You look at communist Russia or these other countries. What's to stop America from becoming that? They're going to attack every single one of us until they have ultimate authority over your everyday life. That's just something we have to wake up to. If you love your country, if you care about your children and your grandchildren, and you hear this show, if you disagree with me, write me. studio13media@gmail.com. Leave a comment on the page. Tell me I'm wrong. Explain to me why I'm wrong so I can understand it.
Yeah, we welcome all comments.
Yeah, I'm not an unreasonable person. If you give me some facts, I don't want your feelings, I don't want your opinions, give me actual facts. I'll listen to them and I'll have a nice, polite, civil discussion with you about it. But if you hear my voice and you hear what I'm saying and it touches your heart and, you know, you get it, it's time to do something. And I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about taking to the streets yet. We haven't reached that point. We still have the ability to vote. We still have elections. We still have the ability to implement change. And we can do that as a people.
Right. Don't be afraid to speak your opinion in a nice way to anybody who's willing to hear it. You know, I think a lot of people have gotten to where they're afraid to talk.
I like everybody's opinion but yours.
Yeah. Well, I understand that. So
I think that's all we have today for today. Mark.
I think that's probably going to cover it for now. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate the viewership, and we're growing, and we appreciate everyone who's come and watched us so far. And if you haven't, like and subscribe, and we will see you again next week. And Greg, that's how we see it. What do you think?